Have you ever noticed that at no point in the Gospels does Jesus celebrate his own birthday? There is no party. There are no birthday wishes. There is no mention of anyone celebrating the day they were born. Not Jesus, not his disciples, not his family. And this is not a gap in the records. It is a deliberate historical fact. In a culture that celebrated with music, dance, food, and family gatherings, individual birthdays simply didn't exist. And when you discover why, and what first-century Jews did instead, you'll understand something about Jesus and his world that most people have never considered. In this video, you will discover why birthdays were considered a pagan practice in the Jewish world of the first century, what Jesus actually celebrated throughout the year, when and how the celebration of Christmas arose, long after the life of Jesus, and what all this reveals about a completely different way of understanding time and life. Stay until the end, because the Christmas story we're going to tell in the second half of this video is one of the most surprising we've ever brought you here. Let's start with a simple observation that most people have never made. Open any of the 4 Gospels, read it from beginning to end. Look for a scene in which Jesus, or any other first-century Jew, celebrates someone's birthday. You won't find it. And that's remarkable when you consider the context. First-century Jewish culture was rich in celebrations. The Jewish religious calendar was filled with festivals, some lasting an entire week, involving trips to Jerusalem, specific meals, music, dances, and rituals passed down through generations for centuries. The Jews of the first century knew how to celebrate. They celebrated with genuine intensity and joy. But the individual birthday, the specific day a person was born, celebrated year after year, simply wasn't part of that culture. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't a lack of celebration. It was a deliberate cultural and religious choice, with deep roots in a specific way of seeing the world. To understand this choice, we first need to understand where the practice of birthdays came from, and why it was associated with something that first-century Jews deeply rejected. For the Jews of the first century, the word that summed up everything they were not was a single word: pagan. The Romans who worshipped Jupiter were pagans. The Greeks who made sacrifices to Apollo were pagans. The Egyptians who venerated Ra were pagans. And one of the practices most clearly associated with the pagan world, especially the Egyptian and Roman worlds, was the celebration of individual birthdays. The Bible records only 2 birthdays being celebrated with festivity, and both occur in a context that Jewish readers would immediately understand as negative. The first is Pharaoh's birthday in Genesis chapter 40. The context is Joseph's imprisonment in Egypt, and it is precisely during the Pharaoh's birthday celebrations that one of the prisoners is released and the other is executed. Pharaoh's birthday is associated, in the biblical text, with arbitrary power and death. The second is Herod Antipas's birthday in Mark 6, the feast where Herodias' daughter dances and, as a reward, asks for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod's birthday is associated, in the biblical text, with the beheading of a prophet. These are not narrative accidents. They are patterns that Jewish readers would clearly recognize. Birthdays happen in the world of powerful pagans, and when they do, they bring death. Origen, a 3rd-century Christian theologian, observed in his writings that the only birthdays mentioned in Scripture are associated with negative figures, Pharaoh and Herod, and that this was no coincidence. This observation reflected a sensitivity that predated Christianity and was rooted in Jewish tradition. But to fully understand why the Jews rejected this practice, we need to understand what the Romans actually did on birthdays. In the Roman world of the 1st century, a birthday was not just a celebration, it was a religious ritual. A Roman man's birthday began with a sacrifice to his ancestors, Genius, the personal guardian deity believed to have entered him at the moment of birth and to have accompanied him throughout his life. The sacrifice usually involved incense, wine, and, in wealthier families, animals. Next came the festive meal, with guests, specific wines, and foods associated with the celebration. Roman sources from the period describe birthday parties with musicians, poetry recitations, and, in some cases, games. For an observant 1st century Jew, every element of this celebration was problematic. The sacrifice to Genius. Personal worship was straightforward polytheism, the worship of a deity other than the God of Israel. The mixing of religion with personal pleasure and self-celebration was alien to a tradition where time was marked by the great acts of God in the collective history of the people, not by the birth dates of individuals. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing at the end of the 1st century, proudly describes how the Jews did not adopt the customs of other peoples, and the list of rejected customs includes pagan festive practices. And this is where the story gets more interesting, because the absence of individual birthdays didn't leave a void in Jewish culture. It was filled by something much richer. But what the researchers found next changed everything, and that's what we're going to see now. The Jewish calendar of the 1st century was one of the densest and most elaborate celebratory structures in the ancient world. There were 7 main festivals, each with its own historical significance, its own rituals, its own foods, and its own emotional atmosphere. Passover, Pesach, lasted 7 days and involved the Seder meal, the narration of the Exodus from Egypt, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and 4 cups of wine. It was the festival of liberation, and every Jew, regardless of where they were in the world, stopped to celebrate. Shavuot, the Feast of First Fruits, or Pentecost, celebrated the giving of the Torah at Sinai and the harvest of the first fruits. It was a festival of gratitude and renewal. Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, lasted 7 days and involved building huts of branches in front of houses in memory of the 40 years of wandering in the desert. It was the most joyous festival of the calendar. Jewish sources from the period describe dances that lasted all night in the temple courtyard. Rosh Hashanah marked the Jewish New Year with the sound of the shofar, the ram's horn, and reflection on the events of the previous year. Yom Kippur was the Day of Atonement, the most solemn day of the year, a day of fasting and self-examination. Purim celebrated the survival of the Jews in Persia with readings aloud, costumes, food, and generosity towards the poor. Hanukkah commemorated the rededication of the temple after the Maccabean revolt, with the progressive lighting of the 8-branched candelabrum. 7 festivals, dozens of days of celebration throughout the year, each with collective memory, specific food, rituals passed down from generation to generation, family gatherings, and genuine emotional expression. Individual birthdays weren't important. Time was marked by the history of an entire people, not by the birth date of one person. If you're new to the channel and want to continue discovering what the world Jesus lived in was really like, subscribe here now. This channel delves deep into content that most people have never seen, and what follows is one of the most surprising stories we've ever brought you. Even if the annual birthday wasn't celebrated, the birth itself held enormous significance in Jewish culture, and the rituals that marked this moment were profound, communal, and full of meaning. The first ritual was circumcision, performed on the 8th day after the birth of every Jewish boy. It was the sign of the covenant between God and the people of Abraham, recorded in the book of Genesis and practiced without interruption for over 2 millennia. It was not merely a physical procedure, it was the boy's formal entry into the community of the people of Israel. The second ritual was the rescue of the firstborn son, called Pidyon Havevri. Firstborn male child symbolically belonged to God, in memory of the firstborn of Israel spared during the 10th plague in Egypt. The father redeemed his son by paying 5 shekels to the priest, in a ritual that affirmed that the son's life was a gift from God, not a possession of the parents. The third was the presentation at the temple, which Luke 2 accurately describes for the birth of Jesus. Mary and Joseph took the child to the temple in Jerusalem, offered 2 doves as a sacrifice, the offering of families who could not afford a lamb, and presented him before God. These 3 rituals together mark the birth of a Jewish child with a depth that no birthday celebration could match. It wasn't about the individual. It was about the covenant, the history, the community, and God. And that is precisely the context in which Jesus was born. These were the rituals that marked his entry into the world. Luke 2 is the most detailed text about the birth of Jesus, and when you read it with the eyes of someone who understands the Jewish rituals of the 1st century, every detail takes on weight. The circumcision on the 8th day, recorded in Luke 2:21, confirms that Jesus entered into the Abrahamic covenant at the time and in the manner prescribed by Jewish law. He was not an exception. He was a 1st century Jew who followed the rituals of his people. The presentation at the temple, recorded in Luke 2:22 through 24, is especially revealing from an economic and social standpoint. The offering made by Mary and Joseph was 2 doves, the offering permitted by law for families who could not afford a lamb. This is a textual confirmation of the family's humble social condition. And it is during this presentation that 2 characters appear, Simeon and Anna, who recognize in the child something that goes beyond any ordinary birth celebration. Luke's text is precise. They were not celebrating a birthday. They were acknowledging the fulfillment of a promise that the entire people had been waiting for centuries.
But here's a fact that many people never realized. After this presentation, the Gospels don't record any annual celebration of Jesus' birth. Not when he was 10 years old, not when he was 20, not during the 3 years of his public ministry. No disciple ever organized a birthday party for him. This is not an oversight on the part of the evangelists. It is a faithful reflection of the culture in which Jesus lived. We've now arrived at the part that surprises people the most when they find out. The annual celebration of Jesus' birth, Christmas, did not exist in the early church. The first Christians did not celebrate the birth of Jesus. They celebrated the resurrection, which was the central event of the nascent Christian faith. What we find in the texts of the first centuries of Christianity are references to Easter, baptism, and the Lord's Supper. The birth of Jesus was known and venerated, but there was no annual feast to celebrate it.
A document called the Deposition of the Martyrs. The text, dated 336 AD, is one of the earliest explicit records of a liturgical celebration of Christ's birth on December 25th in Rome. Although references to the date already appear in earlier Christian writers from the 3rd century, such as Sextus Julius Africanus and Hippolytus of Rome. The process was gradual. With the legalization of Christianity by Constantine in 313 AD and the growing institutionalization of the Church, Christian holidays were consolidated, and the date of December 25th was progressively adopted in different regions of the empire in a process that took decades. Some historians argue that the choice of December 25th
was influenced by pre-existing pagan winter festivals, especially those Saturnalia, Roman women in December, and the invincible sun. Other scholars dispute this interpretation and argue that the date was calculated independently within the Christian tradition, based on speculation about the date of the Incarnation. The debate is legitimate and remains open among experts. What is clear is that the date of December 25th for the birth of Jesus has no basis in the Gospels. The biblical texts do not record the date, and the annual celebration of Christmas, as we know it today, took centuries to become established. This does not diminish the theological significance of Christmas for Christians, but it is a historical fact that completely changes the way we understand the relationship between Jesus and this date. Going back to Jesus, what did he actually celebrate throughout the year? The Gospels are clear. Jesus actively participated in the festivals of the Jewish calendar. The Gospel of John records at least 3 trips by Jesus to Jerusalem for Passover during his public ministry. And there were likely many more throughout his life, as the annual trip to Jerusalem for Passover was a religious obligation for every adult Jew who was able to make it. John 10:22 records Jesus in the temple during the Feast of Dedication, which is Hanukkah, walking through Solomon's portico in winter. It is a precise geographical and temporal detail that confirms that Jesus followed the complete Jewish festive calendar. And Jesus' last meal, the Last Supper, was a celebration of Passover. One of the oldest and most collectively memorable festivals in Judaism. Not just any dinner, a festival that went back to Egypt, to liberation, to the covenant. What this reveals about Jesus is consistent with everything we have seen. He understood time through the collective history of his people, through the great acts of God that shaped the identity of Israel, not through the personal calendar of each individual. And this way of understanding time has something profound to say to us today. There is a fundamental difference between how modern culture marks time and how Jesus and his contemporaries did so. In modern culture, especially in the West, time is marked by individual trajectories: birthdays, graduations, promotions, personal achievements. The personal calendar revolves around the self: what I have accomplished, how much I have grown, where I was a year ago. In first-century Jewish culture, time was marked by collective history, not by what you achieved, but by what God did for the people. Not by your individual growth, but by the shared memory of liberation, covenant, and promise. Passover didn't say, "Celebrate how much you've grown this year." It said, "Remember that your people were enslaved and were freed, and that this liberation defines who you are." Sukkot didn't say, "Celebrate your achievements." It said, "Remember that your people lived in tents in the desert for 40 years and survived because God was present." This view of time did not diminish the individual. It placed him within a story larger than himself, and this, paradoxically, gave more meaning to individual life, not less. So what did we discover in this video? We discovered that Jesus never celebrated his own birthday, not out of carelessness, but because that practice simply didn't exist in first-century Jewish culture. Birthdays were associated with the pagan world, Egyptian and Roman, and the only 2 birthdays recorded in the Bible occur in contexts of arbitrary power and death. We discovered that instead of individual birthdays, first-century Jews had an extraordinarily rich festive calendar, 7 collective festivals throughout the year, each with its own rituals, foods, music, and profound historical memory. We discovered that Jesus' birth was marked by the 3 Jewish birth rituals: circumcision, redemption of the firstborn, and presentation at the temple, precisely described in Luke 2, and that these rituals reveal both the humble social condition of the family and the depth of the tradition in which Jesus was embedded. And we discovered that the annual celebration of Jesus' birth, Christmas, gradually emerged starting in the 4th century, in a process that took decades and whose details are still debated by historians. What can you take away from this for your life? Perhaps a simple question. What do you celebrate, and why? Individual birthdays are a perfectly legitimate and heartfelt practice, but the tradition that Jesus followed suggests that the most profound celebrations are those that connect us to something greater than ourselves, to family, to community, to history, to God.
In a culture that increasingly places the individual at the center of everything, the way Jesus marked time is a quiet and powerful invitation to look a little more outward and a little less in the mirror. If you want to continue discovering this type of content, honest, based on real sources that brings you closer to the historical Jesus and the world he lived in, subscribe here now. Each video is a window into a world that truly existed, with real people and stories that still have something to say to our lives. Until next time.